Every prediction creates a promise. Most are forgotten. This one returned for review. 4 months ago, Raziel published a public forecast on the Iran conflict. Tonight, we're opening that forecast one more time. Tonight isn't about celebrating a prediction. It's about testing one.
Predictions mean nothing unless they're willing to face evidence.
Before we examine each prediction, why review them publicly? Most people simply move on.
Because prediction without verification isn't forecasting, it's storytelling. A forecast should leave evidence behind, otherwise, it teaches us nothing.
Before we go prediction by prediction, what grade would you honestly give yourself?
Around 75%. Good enough to learn from. Not good enough to stop improving.
Before we examine each prediction, let's begin with the overall picture. If you had to assign yourself a grade, what would it be?
I think one number would be misleading. I would separate it into 2 measurements. The first asks, did events unfold generally as described? The second asks, how much of that was genuinely forecast before it happened? Using that standard, I would give the forecast approximately 80% correspondence with subsequent events, but only about 65 to 70% in strict predictive accuracy. That lower score matters. The initial ceasefire had already begun before the episode was released, so I cannot honestly claim full predictive credit for the first announcement. At best, I correctly interpreted what that ceasefire actually meant.
So, your overall score isn't really about being right or wrong. It's about measuring how much was actually forecast before history unfolded.
Exactly. That's the only honest way to evaluate forecasting. If we're willing to count our successes, we must be equally willing to count our mistakes.
Then let's do exactly that. One prediction at a time. Let's begin with your very first forecast, with your very first prediction. You said the first announcement of peace would be more political than real. Why were you so confident?
Because ceasefires and peace agreements are not the same thing. Governments often change their language before they change their strategy. My concern wasn't whether the shooting would slow, it was whether the underlying conflict had actually been resolved. When we reviewed the following weeks, that's exactly what we found. The language changed, the intensity decreased, but shipping, sanctions, and regional pressure never truly disappeared.
So, you would classify this one as strongly correct?
Yes, not because violence stopped, but because the structure of the conflict remained intact.
That's an important distinction. The headlines changed, but the conflict simply changed its form. Your second forecast wasn't really about war. It was about diplomacy. You argued there would be a measurable cooling, accompanied by quiet negotiations.
Exactly. On April 27th, Iran offered through intermediaries to reopen the Strait of Hormuz under specific conditions. The ceasefire remained fragile, but diplomacy had clearly become the dominant language.
So this wasn't perfect, but the overall direction matched the evidence.
Correct. That's why I rate it mostly correct. Not perfect, but clearly supported.
So far, we're seeing something interesting. The strength of the forecast wasn't necessarily predicting isolated events. It was recognizing the sequence in which they unfolded.
Exactly. That's the distinction I hope people understand. Individual headlines can surprise you. Structure is much harder to fake.
One of the more interesting parts of your forecast had nothing to do with Iran itself. It focused on America's allies. You argued they would appear united publicly, while privately becoming increasingly divided.
Correct. I wasn't forecasting a collapse of alliances. I was forecasting a difference between public messaging and practical participation. Those are 2 very different things.
Looking back, France publicly described the conflict as not our war. NATO members became increasingly cautious. Even President Trump criticized Allied participation. That's remarkably close to what you described.
I think this deserves a strong rating. Not because every government behaved identically, but because the broader structural pattern proved remarkably accurate.
Then we arrive at what may have been the strongest part of your forecast. You predicted that sometime between late May and June, there would be an agreement. But you also warned people would mistake it for peace.
The sequence mattered more than the exact wording. First, negotiations. Then, a political framework. Then, public optimism. But none of those developments actually removed the underlying strategic conflict.
And almost immediately, renewed exchanges followed. The framework survived, but the conflict did not disappear.
If I had to identify the strongest part of the forecast, it would be this. Not because I predicted a ceasefire, but because I argued the ceasefire would not be the ending. It would simply be another stage of the conflict.
So, at this point, we're no longer evaluating isolated headlines. We're evaluating whether the overall architecture of the forecast survived contact with reality. And so far, it largely has. I think this may have been the most important part of the entire forecast. You argued that the war wouldn't actually end. It would simply change form.
Exactly. My argument wasn't that the shooting would continue unchanged. It was that pressure would migrate, away from headlines and toward logistics, shipping, energy, maritime control, economic leverage.
Looking back, that's almost exactly what happened. The Strait of Hormuz became the central bargaining instrument. Shipping, energy, and logistics remained under constant pressure.
Of every forecast, this is the one I have the greatest confidence in, because it wasn't predicting an isolated event. It was describing the underlying structure of the conflict.
That's an interesting distinction. You weren't forecasting where every bomb would fall. You were forecasting how the conflict itself would evolve. You also warned that another escalation would come after people believed the war was ending.
That became one of the strongest confirmations. Every apparent ending was followed by another phase. The conflict never disappeared, it simply evolved.
Looking back, June, and especially July, validated that sequence remarkably well.
Wars don't always end. Sometimes they simply change uniforms, change tactics, change language. But underneath, they remain the same conflict.
We've spent most of this conversation discussing what held up. But credibility isn't built there. It's built when you're willing to examine what didn't. If you had to identify the weakest parts of the forecast, where would you begin?
The first issue is timing. The initial ceasefire had already begun before the episode was published. I correctly interpreted its fragility, but I cannot honestly claim that I predicted the announcement itself. Second, some of my language was too broad. Terms like containment or structural erosion accurately describe the situation, but they are more difficult to test objectively than a precise forecast.
You also marked yourself down on the economic forecast.
Correct. I expected the broader household effects to emerge 30 to 60 days later. Instead, some sectors, particularly trucking, were already under severe pressure much earlier. The direction was right. The timing deserves a lower score.
And finally, there are predictions that simply remain unproven.
Exactly. If the evidence isn't there, I don't count it as a success. Forecasting doesn't improve by claiming victories. It improves by honestly measuring what can and cannot yet be demonstrated.
I think this may be the most important part of today's conversation. Not because you got everything right, but because you're willing to publicly identify what still needs to be proven. Before we close, what does the chart suggest happens next?
3 stages. First, another limited but highly visible military action or preparations so clear they cannot be ignored. Second, Iran returns to negotiations. Third, both sides accept terms they had previously rejected. The president then declares that military pressure produced the agreement.
Does that begin in August?
August may bring the announcement of a framework or provisional understanding. It may allow the president to appear victorious, but it should not be mistaken for the final end. The strongest window for a documented settlement or declared conclusion of major operations appears between December 10th and December 21st. Even then, the agreement looks conditional and fragile. A more durable ending may not emerge until April 2027.
How precise can those dates be?
They cannot be treated as exact. The recorded hours of the authorization and the first strike are approximate. In astrology, even a small difference in time can alter the houses and therefore the timing. That uncertainty is one of the greatest difficulties in making a precise prediction.
So the president may claim victory before the conflict is truly over.
Yes, the public declaration may arrive first. History will decide whether the peace survives.
Then the prediction remains open.
And so does the investigation.
The forecast remains open. When the facts are known, Jessica and Raziel will return to measure the prediction against the truth.